In the century after Jerusalem was destroyed, great rabbis and teachers like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wandered the country, being forced ever further northwards as the Roman wars engulfed more and more of the land. They taught and they preached in little synagogues like this one. They spent a lot of their time giving advice to people about the correct forms of ritual behaviour, things that earlier would have been decided by the priests in Jerusalem in verbal argument. There are hundreds of legendary stories about these rabbis. Sometimes, too, the learned academies they founded. They were great teachers, they were great disputers. They would travel distances to see each other, to have arguments, sometimes to discuss points of law, to remember, perhaps, too, the old academies they'd been at in Jerusalem. And then there were generations of students that followed them in precisely the same way. But the most important work of these rabbis, and it was the most important work, was to memorialise on paper the ritual, the records, and the whole ethos of Judaism, the Judaism that was so near to extinction. Over several generations, all the leaders of Judaism gathered together. The scholars and the rabbis from the great cities of the East, from Babylon and Alexandria. The survivors, too, of the priesthood and the schools of Old Jerusalem, all gathered now to build the sacred books into a Bible. So the first thing the scribes had to do was to sit down and make sure that the rabbis were dealing with a text that were consistent. Every line had to be the same from one version to the other, and that was quite a thing to decide on. It said that one little scribe, in one night, burned an extra 100 measures of oil, just preparing the book of Ezekiel for the rabbis to examine next day. The rabbis, of course, examined whole books. They had no trouble with the center of the faith, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. They obviously had no trouble with the book of Kings and the books of Judges. These great books automatically could not but be included in the canon of religious texts. But there were later books that caused much more problems. Book of Esther, for example, had been written by a woman. That was a bit dodgy in itself. So they cut it in half and kicked half out and left half in. There was the book of Maccabees, which was a splendid Greek history, but didn't seem too religious, so that went out. In fact, there's quite a collection of them that went out. And funnily enough, the Christians had already included them in their Old Testament. When they discovered that the rabbis had later left them out, they sort of pushed them to one side, so they became the Christian Apocrypha. But it's very difficult talking about this stuff, because you don't have any proper record of what went on. What you have is dozens and dozens of marvellous stories, especially of the rabbis that seem to dominate the proceedings. And one of these, and typical of them, was a man called Rabbi Akiva, a man considered so intelligent that Moses himself couldn't understand him. There's a wonderful story of how actually he saved the Song of Songs, that great erotic poem, for our Bible. And the story goes that they were having a meeting and people were getting really worried about the Song of Songs. Should this marvellous piece of literature go into a sacred volume? And Akiva, who wasn't exactly known for his liberal attitudes. I mean, when one of his parishioners came to him and said he was contemplating suicide, Akiva told him he used a strong rope. So, Akiva addressed the meeting, so the story goes, and he said, "Brothers, all the sacred texts are sacred, but the Song of Songs is the most sacred of all." What he meant was, I think, that the Song of Songs, that piece of pure erotica, should be in the Bible because the Bible should represent the whole body of man from its beginning to its end, and therefore needed something like that in the middle. So it's through these legendary debates that the Bible has come down to us today, and through men, through legendary figures like Akiva himself. Akiva came to a terrible end. This is his tomb. Seems that when the old man was about 70, he went on the warpath. I think he must have decided that what he really wanted to do was to go back to the Jerusalem of his youth, when the temple was there and when the great scribal academies and studying had been all over the great city. So he got a local resistance leader and christened him as the Messiah, and together they set Judea alight. The war went on for 5 years, We don't know much about it. It was quite terrible. The old Jewish histories tell us that the Roman cavalry charges at the end, the horses were wading in blood up to their chests. Some of the Jews committed suicide, wrapping their children in the sacred scrolls and setting fire to them. Kiva himself was captured. He refused to give up teaching the law, and the Romans tortured him to death, combing the flesh from his body, it is said, with combs of iron. Well, as many Jews had done in such final moments, Akiva started to recite the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. Then he suddenly stopped and smiled. And the torturers, who were obviously not used to such things, were quite alarmed at this, and they stepped back from him and said, old man, why do you mock us? What are you doing? They're obviously frightened at his power. And Akiva said, calm yourselves. I've just realized for the first time in my life a new meaning for these verses, and started out on a learned exposition, the last of his life, with this old guardian of the sacred scriptures, delivered to his Roman torturers. And with that, as the Jewish history says, the old man gave up his soul to God.